Thanks, Hillary, and to Surya for inviting me. I'm a bit of an interloper. This is going to be more of a social science presentation and a presentation based on some of the work that we've done on employment and the sort of situation of black and minority ethnic people in the UK. Having said that, I have given this talk to sort of corporates. I've been a judge at corporate diversity awards and at the public and in public sector organizations on why diversity still matters. And with the caveat here that some of the things I'll be talking about are perhaps, we'll have to think through about how they apply to music, to classical music, to jazz. But I think there's still lessons that we can learn, and I'm hoping to learn as well. So if you haven't heard of Runnymede, Runnymede is a think tank. We focus on race equality. We've been around since 1968. I lead our research and policy work that includes in areas, as I said, in unemployment, employment, access to finance, business, politics. We have a launch tomorrow in the House of Commons on the study we did on how black people voted in 2010. So we have a sort of wide range of activities, but our focus is on race equality and trying to ensure, of course, that in the future, people from black and minority ethnic backgrounds have equal chances in our society. Two bits of context, I think, that are extremely relevant in general in thinking about opportunities for black and minority ethnic people, but I think specifically as well for classical and jazz, is that as you all know, you probably saw the 2011 census, probably not looking at it as in detail as I do in my day job, but the population is growing significantly, and it's also diversifying significantly. Sorry, this is some sort of alarm. It's distressing. I don't like buzzing next to me. Sorry, so in 2001, the population was around 4.5 million black and minority ethnic people. The most recent census from 2011 suggests almost 8 million people. We've done a projection, a forecast of the population until 2051, and that forecast, which is of course based on a number of assumptions around birth rates and migration, which I don't need to get into detail, but the key finding is that in 2051, a sort of average forecast is that almost 30% of the UK population will be black and minority ethnic, and we're talking almost 20 million people. So one of the reasons that's relevant is we have to think not just about what we're doing today, but what we're doing for young people today, because in the future this is going to even be a larger part of the UK's population. And just to think about 8 million today, that's the same as the population of Scotland plus Wales. So there's as many black and minority ethnic people living in the UK as there are living in Scotland and in Wales together. I think the other background that unfortunately remains the case is that there's a lot of racial inequalities in our society today. The employment gap, that is the gap between the proportion of white people who are employed in our society and the proportion of ethnic minorities who are employed, is 11%. And while that's gone sort of up and down, it's not that much better than it was in the 1980s. The unemployment rate for young black men right now, that's 18 to 24, is nearly 50%. And even groups that are doing better, for example, Chinese pupils, who we all know do very well at GCSE and A-level attainment, actually do worse than the job market. So whereas they do well when it comes to getting educational attainment, that's not translating into doing well in terms of getting jobs. I think all of these things are worth thinking about in the context of classical music, because I think when we're talking about progression, there may be some issues there that we can learn from. A lot of FTSE 100 companies are now looking at their progression policies and whether or not they unfairly disadvantage people. Senior management teams getting unconscious bias testing, because a lot of people do have, of course there's conscious racism and prejudice out there, but a lot of things are of course unconscious, and people might think that people who look like that just aren't suitable for a finance role or suitable for being a violinist. One of the other bits of work that I've been doing is on savings, and I know that may sound a bit not relevant here, but as we all know, it's one thing to say that you have a decent income as a family, but it also matters what kinds of wealth and assets you can tap into. If you have generations of inherited wealth, it's easier for you to have your child make decisions that might require quite a lot of investment. So the average wealth holdings for white British people is £221,000, but for the average black Caribbean family, it's £76,000. And for the average Bangladeshi family, it's £21,000, and for the average black African family, £15,000. So you're talking, 10 to 15 times less assets and savings for black African families. And I think that has a big impact on their willingness to see their children potentially take up a risky employment situation. And I don't want to sort of distill everything into jobs and employment, but the reality is for groups that are doing worse off, they do have to think about, is this a suitable employment route for my child? And we found this in getting into debate about Oxford. You may have seen 2 years ago, Oxford didn't accept any black Caribbean men. And when we got into a discussion with their admissions office, the thing they said to us, well, too many of them are applying to become doctors and lawyers, and those are our most competitive courses. They should rather be, applying for other types of qualifications like classics, which I found a little curious. But anyway, one of the things that reveals, I think, is that for children of migrants and for parents who may have experienced discrimination themselves in the labor market or may not have social networks that cut across the entirety of sort of the labor market, it makes sense to advise your child to do a degree in medicine or law. That's what my parents advised. It's a very typical migrant piece of advice, where you don't have social networks, where you don't understand the quote-unquote host labor market. Giving people qualifications that guarantee them employment outcomes is actually very good advice as a parent. So I think we do have to think about this. I appreciate that not the entire value of the arts should be socioeconomic, despite what the minister says. I think that she's obviously recognizes that there are other values as well. And I'm just going to quickly run through 3 reasons why we think a diverse workforce matters. And we do think, actually, that the socioeconomic arguments are important, but they're not the only ones. I mean, to put it in a sort of more technical language, when we talk about it, there's sort of justice or moral-based reasons why we should have a diverse workforce or a diverse orchestra. There are efficiency arguments, and then there are competition arguments. And I'll try to explain those each in turn. I think with the justice moral-based arguments, one of the interesting things here is the notion that everyone should have equal opportunities and that in a democratic society, everyone's chances should be more or less equal. And I think with the case of the arts, to the extent that we have public funding of the arts, there's an interesting question about how far those sorts of justice-based reasons for a more diverse arts community apply. I think in the corporate sector, when I make that argument, it's obviously less applicable because they're not publicly having to justify their behavior in the same kind of ways to democratic representatives. I think the efficiency argument has been important. It's been recognized across sort of a wide variety of organizations that more diverse opinions leads to better outcomes. Economists have kind of tried to model this, but basically we all overestimate how good we are at doing things. There's tons of things, and I think in an orchestra you should be well aware of that. The bassoonist and the violinist have their own roles, and it would be crazy to assume that you can just replace those people like for like. And the findings from the economics literature is that diverse people with diverse range of viewpoints get better decisions, come to better decisions than trying to get one single genius to solve problems. And it's that very, it basically has to do with the limits of human knowledge. I mean, we all have sort of limits on what we know, and it's based both on our experiences and what we've been trained to do. So the more diverse viewpoints you can bring into a room, the more likely you're able to come to good solutions to complex problems. And I think the third sort of argument around competition is quite interesting, I think, in the context of competition both for domestically for arts audiences, but also I think internationally in thinking about the quote-unquote talent pool and whether or not, if Britain isn't sufficiently diverse, whether or not that will have a negative impact on the competition. But before I conclude, I do want to highlight one thing about an argument for positive action that might be seen as one of the ways to ensure diversity. And I think I just want to explain one aspect of the justification for positive action that I think has been misunderstood. A lot of the focus on talking about positive action or programs to increase outreach have focused on the individual beneficiary who gets into that program. So the person who gets into an outreach program or the individual who gets promoted for an internship or something like that. I think it's really crucial that we don't forget why we have these programs. Yes, it is to benefit that individual, but there are 2 other groups of people we're trying to benefit. One is the wider group. We're trying to say that that entire group is suffering disadvantage. And if we have members from that group now represented where they weren't before, that's good from the point of view of democracy and efficiency, but it's also good in terms of social networks, like we're talking about here today. If you don't know anyone who's in a particular part of the labor market or a particular part of the society, it's quite difficult to know how you get ahead in those areas. So the specific beneficiary isn't just sort of benefiting themselves. The notion is that they're supposed to benefit the wider group. And of course, that was the original justification for positive action, is that the entire group is disadvantaged, not that the individual is disadvantaged. And I think that the other group that does benefit from a more diverse and workforce or orchestra is everyone, or the society at large, or the economy. Those figures I pointed to before, 11% employment gap, 50% unemployment rate for young black men, but rising to 30% of the population, basically means Britain is going to have to be resigned to falling further and further down the league table of the GDP global table unless we do something to respond to these things. So there's a benefit that redounds on all of us when we improve the diversity. And I think that's true also of orchestras. I think that's true also in terms of thinking about whether or not we can pitch to a wider audience, whether or not we're taking advantage of the talent that we've got. Yes, I think that's about it. I'm happy to go into further detail about some actual evidence about this. I've talked at a quite high level about how these benefits happen, but there's plenty of evidence internationally that sort of a more diverse workforce in particular. So I recognize those caveats. Those are about workforces and about public bodies. But I think that there's some stuff that we can learn there about how organizations like IBM, like medical schools in India have all recognized the value of these things in order to, not just for the point of view of justice, but from the point of view of efficiency and competition, and ultimately for the economic bottom line, which is, of course, a consideration that also applies to you. Thanks.